sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas. His hand the wonders wrought. This is my Father's world. The birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair. In the rustling grass I hear him pass. He speaks to me everywhere. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world. The battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven be one.
This is 20 Pages a Week, and I am your host, Hal Hammons. We are on a journey reading all the way through the Bible this year. Thanks for coming along. This week's reading is Numbers. Joining us for the discussion this week is Kyle Sanders from Clinton, Mississippi. Thank you for joining me, Kyle. How's everything going?
Good morning from Mississippi. Everything's going really well. Excited to get our study going. Wish it were a little warmer, but we don't have any control over that. But looking forward to the discussion over Numbers today.
Great. Well, let's start with your first impressions.
Well, I'm going to give my first impression is this is perhaps the worst titled book in the Bible. As far as title indicating what you're going to find, with Psalms, we're going to find Psalms, Proverbs. Matthew, you expect something from Matthew. Numbers, in terms of the story of what you find in Numbers, are sort of secondary to this. Of course, the Hebrews, the Jews didn't call the book Numbers. They call it by a different name. But the actual two censuses that are given are really sort of secondary to the story. So that's one thing I noticed right off the bat is the title's not particularly helpful. And when most people, if they see the word Numbers, that goes along with their predisposition to not like numbers generally. So it may be a bit of a turnoff. But I hope that's not the case because it's an incredibly interesting book. Lots of different styles of literature found in Numbers. It moves from different style, from law to narrative to prophecy to it's just all of even poetry. It's all over the place.
Mm-hmm. I am, from the standpoint of somebody who's put the material together and is trying to encourage people to keep reading. Numbers is, I will admit, a bit of a relief. You read Genesis, and Genesis is great. And you read Exodus, and the first half of Exodus is great. And then you get into some heavy stuff there, and you get Leviticus, and these are long readings that I'm asking people to go through. And Leviticus is not anybody's top 10 book. and then you get the first half of Numbers, and you're going through the same kind of thing. And I'm trying to encourage everybody, whether online or in person here in Georgetown, just stick with it. It's going to get better. It really is. It's not all like this. And I don't mean to suggest that the dry parts of the reading aren't important, because they are in their own way, but it's not always all that interesting. And when you get past the census bit, when you get past all the I call it real estate transactions, essentially, for property that was going to be given out to people in another nation 3,000 years ago. How much could that possibly have to do with me? Probably not very much. But when you get past that, then you get some very interesting narrative and stuff that is very, very practical, and not necessarily in a positive way for us as Christians today.
Yeah, I always like to point out that even in the sections and in Numbers, of course, Numbers 1, you have the census. And then a little later on, you have really the description of the marching orders. There are details in those sections that do matter later on in the story. I'll give you one of these. So in Numbers 1, the representative of the tribe of Judah is Nahshon, the son of Amminadab.
Mm-hmm.
That same tribe of Judah will be then leading Israel away from Mount Sinai towards the land of Canaan. Well, Nahshon, the son of Amminadab, is in the lineage of Jesus. He's the ancestor through who David will come, and then later on Jesus. So it's an interesting symbolic picture that you have there of the family and the person through whom eventually Jesus would come. Is he and his tribe are selected to lead Israel to the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of those small details where if we're looking at the text and we go, okay, well, this is a census, I'm just going to kind of go over that. You can miss things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The little nuggets that are really valuable to study and
later on
motivate you to look at those sections.
Later on, Nashon's son Salmon Salmon, or however it's pronounced, is generally assumed to be one of the two spies that goes into Jericho, meets Rahab, and the two of them, their son is Boaz. Well, we've heard of Boaz. It's the narrative is there. We don't have very much detail at all at how this works out, but the narrative is there if you look for it. All right, what one story jumps out at you?
Wow. So important stories out of the book of Numbers. That doesn't narrow it down much. There are some absolutely critical texts in the book. I wanted to focus this morning on chapters 13 and 14, the spies being sent into Canaan.
Right. That is the story.
I think so. And in fairness, let's go to the story where the narrative truly flips from, and not in a sense that everything goes wrong in chapter 13. Things are not really going swimmingly up till chapter 13.
Mm-hmm.
But it's at this point in the story where the Exodus comes to really a grinding halt. And Israel gets to circle in the wilderness for, very nearly 40 years before they get to go to the land of Canaan. Really, really important section. So that's sort of where, if we had a few minutes, I'd like to spend some time there.
Sure.
So first of all, the point I like to make beginning is when you read the account of the spies, this is Numbers 13, beginning in verse 4. Nobody remembers the names of the other 10. And this sort of goes, if you're on the right side with God, then your name gets remembered, like Joshua and Caleb. If you're on this other side, your name doesn't get remembered. They are sent into the land of Canaan to really scope out the land, go see who's there, go see what sort of blessings that there are. You remember they're expecting a land flowing with milk and honey. So the request is essentially go and see if it's as God has promised you. And they go into the land, verse 21. They go into all these different areas. They meet individuals who are quite large. They meet fruit that is even larger. And they bring some of it back and they begin to give their report. What I want to notice first in 13 and verse 25, we have sort of the true report from 25 to 29, and then we have the doctored or the reimagined report. It's really a tale of two reports. They describe, beginning in verse 27, Notice the specific, it flows with milk and honey, right? This was the promise that was given to them prior to their leaving. Now it's come to pass. This land truly is what God said it was going to be. We get there, we notice that it's strong and the cities are fortified and large. Those are details that go together with economic prosperity. You're not going to go see a land flowing with milk and honey and then it be inhabited by weaklings. Those two go together. The economics and military power, they tend to support one another. They see the Amalekites in verse 29. They describe the different nations that are there. Caleb's response in verse 30, let's go do it. Let's press forward. Let's go occupy the land. And we're able to do this. But then you get their interpretation or rather their opinion on what they can do versus what they've seen. They decide in verse 31, we're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. And then beginning in verse 32, you get the creative description of the land and their ability to conquer it. Mm-hmm. They describe this land flowing with milk and honey as a land that devours its inhabitants, a phrase that interestingly will come of the bear in verse chapter 16, where the land's literally going to devour somebody. The land that devours the Canaanites will eventually be the land where Israel is devoured, and for the same reason, for sin. They see, I love this reference in verse 33. And there we saw the Nephilim, in reference to the sons of Anak that they see. Mm. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. They've looked at the land. It is flowing with milk and honey, but it's also flowing with giants. And in the face of this, they say, it's just not possible. It's not doable. We can't do it. What are some thoughts you had up to that? I have a couple of other things I was going to say about that specifically, but
well, I think that's exactly right. And it's the people have. This is a God that they were not very well acquainted with a couple of years ago. Most of them, anyway. The worship of Jehovah, Yahweh, is exactly how much was going on in Egypt. The text does not really allude to it. Every indication is it's kind of a cultural rarity that it kind of gone by the wayside. Moses, at Mount Sinai the first time, said they're not going to know what God I'm talking about if I tell them I'm came from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Moses has been trying to introduce them to Yahweh for the last couple of years or so, and it's been a slow learning process, a slow learning curve, very much so. And they continue to rely on what they are capable of, what they understand, what makes sense to them. And so to a certain degree, it's probably natural and certainly in keeping with the national character for them to go into this land and say, we can't do this. Well, God never said you could do it. God said you would do it through his help. But there was never any indication. You're going to find a nation that's a pushover. You're going to find a bunch of people who are not expecting you, who are taking themselves for granted, and it's just going to be a walk in the park. It was never going to be that. It was going to be a victory for God, just like the Red Sea was, and others we could talk about as well. It's not about finding your own capability. It's about trusting in God, and they weren't ready to do that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Red Sea, because this is really a repetition of the same thing. They look and they see overwhelming odds, and they say, well, it's just not possible. We can't do it. In the Red Sea instance, you brought us out here to die. Israel's going to say that a few more times in the book of Numbers. You brought us out here to die. You're not feeding us well. We're going to, thirst to death. Different versions of that. And they are just terrified of this. What's fascinating to me about Numbers 13 is, and God's response to what they do. Of course, the people, they incite the people to rebel in the beginning of chapter 14. Moses intercedes for them, and then, but we still have the judgment that's rendered. And the judgment is everyone is going to die above a certain age, except for Joshua and Caleb. They're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness, a year for every day, it says in Numbers 14. What gets me about this is, in it, with the 20 pages a week study, it wasn't long ago we were in Genesis 6. Really just a few weeks ago. This is a repeat of the judgment against the entire world in Genesis 6 through 9 with the flood. It bears a lot of the same markers. We find all Israel is faithless except for these two men.
Mm-hmm.
God judges their faithlessness with, well, you're not going to survive. You're not going to get to go to Canaan. You have to spend this time in the wilderness. The number 40 is selected for the time of judgment in the same way in Genesis. Of course, it ran 40 days and 40 nights. What gets me about this, verse 33, they say that they saw the Nephilim. The Nephilim died in the flood. They weren't on the ark. But and this shows you the effect they wanted to have with their speech. They didn't see the Nephilim. They saw the sons of Anak. But what's the best way to terrify the nation of Israel? Well, we saw these mythical, giant, tyrant warlords, or however you want to word Nephilim.
Mm-hmm.
And we just can't do it. It's not possible. And they really sway Israel to that. Moses and Aaron recognize the issue in chapter 14 and verse 9, only do not rebel against the Lord. Your lack of belief that God can do this is rebellion. Because like you said, like you mentioned a moment ago, it was never going to be the fact that Israel could do it. Israel, should they stick with God, would be given this land. And of course that doesn't go well. In verse 10, they try to stone them with stones, and then the Lord shows up to pronounce judgment, beginning there in verse 10.
Isn't this just kind of a lived out in the flesh version of the whole war of salvation by grace versus salvation by works that we're wrestling with all of this time? As God's people, we want to show ourselves to be worthy. We want to show ourselves to be capable, and which is fine as far as that goes. But oftentimes it pushes us to somehow qualify for the land of Canaan. And eventually we realize that we can't, that we're not good enough. That brings on despair. We want to quit at this point. If we would sit back and allow God to give us what he's trying to give us in his way, obviously, there's obedience involved. But if we would allow him to work his way in us and just kind of get out of his way, it would be a whole lot simpler for us. It'd be a lot more successful and pleasant for us. But we want to be in charge. We want to be the boss. We want to be the hero. And God is always going to be the hero in the Bible story. We can talk about Moses being a hero or Caleb being a hero or whatever, but God is the hero here. God is the one who is going to give his people what they need and what they have been promised. It's not going to be us earning it or qualifying it at all.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because, and like you said, it has to be on God's terms. To accept this gift, you have to accept it on God's terms. And God's terms in this case are trust me, follow me, do as I've asked you to do, go where I've asked you to go, and I will give you this great blessing. But the idea that God's the hero of the story, in Moses' intercession in chapter 14 and verse 13 through verse 19, the reasons Moses gives for why he should forgive Israel have nothing to do with Israel and what they've done and who they are. What they've done and who they are, they deserve the wandering in the wilderness, is what they've earned by this. It's based on God's character and what the nations will say about God, and the fact that if this happens, they will look poorly at God and his character will be dragged through the mud. It is based on God's having identified himself in Exodus 34, the God that is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. He quotes this here. Pardon this people I love this verse 19, according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Our salvation's based on you, and we beg for it based on your nature. That in no way sets aside what that faithfully loving God has asked them to do. But the reason why it's happening is based on him, not on them.
And then we get this interesting flip where we realize that being in God's favor and not doing what God tells you to do is bad. And not being in God's favor and doing what God tells you to do, that's bad too. It's it's
Mm-hmm.
not one's not better than the other. You have to be
Right.
in God's grace and then take the land. Well, we'll take the land without being in God's grace. That's not the way it works. This you were just telling me a few minutes ago that you were incapable of doing this, right? That was the whole story. We're
Right.
not able to take the land. What makes you capable of taking the land now? Nothing has changed. The only thing that changed is you're not in God's favor anymore. And that was
Mm-hmm.
the thing that was going to give you the land. So, but they're
Yeah.
going to bumble into this anyway, and of course they get routed because we have to have the grace and we have to have the obedience. They both have to go together.
Yeah. There are. I'm glad you said that. There are. Did you notice? This is just sort of a general point about numbers, that there are several one-liners that are just tremendous in the book of Numbers. One of those we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but to that point, 14 and verse 41. Why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord when that will not succeed? I
Mhm.
love the way that's worded in the ESV. Is why are you going to press on this path when it won't work? That's sadly not enough to dissuade them from trying, as it is today in 2021. But that thought is an important one.
Mhm.
Why go against God's command? That's not going to work for you. It hasn't worked yet. And as you go through the story, it never works. So, what's the definition of insanity? Try the same thing over and over and expect different results. This is what we try to do with God is we say, well, we think it would be best if we try it our way and we hope you'll be okay with it. And that never pans out. And you just see that same story repeated here.
Absolutely. Let's move on and talk about a verse that might have grabbed your attention. Sound like you had one in mind.
Oh, it was really a struggle to narrow it down to one. There are some, like I mentioned a moment ago, there are just some tremendous lines in Exodus. I'm sorry, Numbers. I'm stuck on Exodus. Um, is the arm of the Lord shortened? It is a tremendous phrase. 14 and 41. Why are you doing this when this will not work? I want to go to Numbers 16 and 22.
Okay.
This is in, of course, the account of Korah's rebellion. Korah and others essentially try to form a coup and wrest power away from Moses and from that structure also. I think that's an important thing too. It's not just Moses. It's the entire leadership sort of structure. They want to cast that away
Mm-hmm.
because in 16 and verse 3, they assemble against Moses and Aaron. So this is sort of we're tired of this leadership structure. You've got to go. We're going to take over. Of course, that doesn't go well. And the way it doesn't go well, I think, is interesting. In 16 and verse 20, God responds to this by saying in 21, separate yourselves from among this congregation that I may consume them in a moment. This is the congregation, the people gathered together. And God says, separate, I'm going to wipe them out. Not the only time it happens in the book of Numbers. They say this in verse 22. O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation? And then based on that phrase, the Lord responds, okay, get away from these specific men and their dwelling. That, for one, the phrase that's used there, God of the spirits of all flesh, it's only used in Numbers, and it's only used twice. Once here in 16 and 22, and then farther along in reference to Joshua in Numbers 27 and verse 16. But doesn't that idea sound familiar? Reading it from our perspective, reading it from the other side of the cross. Shall one man sin and will you be angry with all the congregation? That is, of course, not what Jesus did. Jesus didn't sin, but this idea that one would suffer instead of everyone suffering because of sin.
Mm-hmm.
It's repeated many times, of course, in the Old Testament, but this one just sort of caught me off guard reading it. You don't expect to find this here. I do think it is something that would connect further along to Jesus, especially when you consider that God of the spirits of all flesh. It's used about Joshua. Of course, Jesus is the figure of Joshua that would come up later. The idea that, from 2 Corinthians 5, God made him to be sin who knew no sin. This idea that God will punish one instead of punishing all, um, is the thought that I really like from this verse. I found it interesting. So later on, this is from John's gospel. Caiaphas, you remember, brings up the fact that, first of all,
Right.
the phrase he uses there, "You know nothing at all," is just tremendous. And he says, "Don't you understand that it's better for one person to die instead of everyone to die?"
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but wonder if he was thinking about Numbers 16 and Korah. Don't you
Mm-hmm.
recognize that it was better for Korah to die than for Israel to die? So just that was the phrase that in this reading through sort of grabbed my attention, um, because it has echoes later on in the story.
It reminded me kind of the opposite way, going backward to the Garden of Eden. Maybe I'm spending too much time around Philip Martin. If he's listening, he'll get a
No,
kick
you
out of
can't
this.
spend enough time in the garden.
But the God gives breath to all. He
Yes.
gave breath to Adam, and through Adam we all have life. But
Mhm.
Adam sinned, and at least in a fashion, as Paul says in Romans 5, through Adam we all sin.
Mhm.
Well, are we all going to die just because one person messed up? Well, were it not for the grace of God, yes, we
Mhm.
would. But God is going to provide us safety through obedience, through His grace. We can distance ourselves, and the whole contagion thing. This was a real running plot through the book of Leviticus. Uncleanness is contagious. You need
Mhm.
to get it out of the camp. You need to isolate it. You need to find out how bad it is immediately. And when you find out, you deal with it appropriately. And this idea of isolating the sin, isolating the sinner, it's a pervasive theme really throughout the scripture. We
Mhm.
get upset at the wrath of God in cases like the and the reference is made again to Nadab and Abihu in the book of Numbers that
Mhm.
God killed him. Well, why did he kill him? Well, there's probably a variety of reasons, but probably the biggest one is we can't have this kind of behavior. This is contagious. This will spread. And by isolating the sin and dealing with the sin, then we put ourselves in a position to grow from this. Now, of course, Israel's going to do the opposite, as they typically did in the wilderness. They're going to get angry at Moses. You've destroyed the people of God. This
Mhm.
odd attraction to this nation that is priding itself on its rebellion is very confusing in chapter 16 and 17. This is the calling card of Korah, right? The whole nation is holy. A
Mhm.
chapter and a half ago, you refused to take the land of Canaan because you didn't have any faith, and now all of a sudden you're on par with Moses. Where do we get the gall to make arguments like this?
Yeah.
It's just almost silly if it weren't so sad. And that contrast with Moses, I was looking at chapter 12, verse 3, where it says Moses was the most humble of all men,
Mhm.
depending on your translations. And this is in the
Right.
context of the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron, of all people, pushing back against him, and going back earlier in the context to the distribution of the Spirit to the 70 elders, and that two of them had continued to prophesy in the camp. And Joshua said, "There's going to be trouble. You got competition here. You got these fellows running around prophesying." Moses says, "I wish everybody was prophesying. You don't know what my
Yes.
day is like." Going back to the original was it Exodus 18, where he meets with Jethro and he's trying to administer
Mhm.
for the entire nation, and Jethro says, "You're going to kill yourself doing this. You got to let go of some of this," and he's able to do that. The burden that is on Moses constantly through all of this, you know, and while he's doing it, having to put up with rebellion, having to put up with knotheads, and then his brother and sister doing this too. I mean, is anybody going to give me a break through all of this?
Yeah.
But except for the one notable exception, again in the book of Numbers, he is able to bear through this uh, peaceably, calmly, with faith. The example that Moses gives in Numbers is just incredible. And the irony, assuming that Moses is holding the pen while he's writing all of this down, writing how humble he is, it's almost bragging about how humble you are. That seems a little
Mm-hmm.
bit incongruous. I like to think of this as being an editorial insertion that Joshua or somebody else put in later. You don't understand what it was like living with this guy. This man was amazing. It was just, putting up with all of this stuff. And anyway,
Yeah. And
Moses,
Moses reached the breaking point. When you refer to Israel as an infant that you have to carry, and and essentially wish for death. If this is how it's going to be going forward, just take my life because I'm really done with this.
mm-hmm.
And the fact that Moses does eventually crack under this, he does crack, and sadly, when you think about Moses in Numbers, that's sometimes the one thing we remember is, yes, he smote the rock instead of speaking to it. Well, he is just a tremendous example of someone holding up, keeping the faith and keeping all of this together and moving forward. I can't help but think that when the mantle is passed to Joshua, uh, Joshua understands what he's going to have to do. And this, I mean, he's lived with Moses now for many years and seen firsthand who they are and what he's going to have to face in leading them. Just astounding to me. The looks forward in Numbers to Jesus are really special. You mentioned 12 and verse 29. Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit on them. This is Moses's wish. I wish I had help, but it also is a look forward to.
It's 11:29, right?
I'm sorry, 11:28. That's right. Um, it's a look forward to what would eventually happen in Christ. When God describes Moses as in 12 and verse 7, faithful in all my house, with him I speak mouth to mouth. And then towards the middle of that verse, he beholds the form of the Lord. Descriptions used of Moses that will have a greater fulfillment in Christ. And just those looks forward we have the privilege and the advantage of seeing those. The Old Testament readers and writers didn't have those. So it's just, those are really special to me.
Oh, yeah.
I like when those pop up.
Moses has tough to say that he's become one of my heroes because I've been studying about Moses all my life, but the impact that Moses had in his day and continues to have, there's nobody in the Bible like Moses. It's an incredible thing. Before we close up,
Really.
give me one word.
The one word I think that pops up in Numbers is different variants on the idea of fire. It literally is everywhere. The first place name you find, or the first place you find named, is in reference to burning. Horma, I believe that is in Numbers 10.
Because the fire broke out in the camp.
Right. Or I'm sorry, Taberah in 11 and verse 3, the burning in the camp. The Lord's anger burns hotly. There's the fierce anger of the Lord. You have the fiery serpents later on in the book. It's not the only thing you find in the book. The book is not 100% judgment and wrath, but there is an overwhelming amount of it. And it points forward to a realistic look at people relating with God. And in that circumstance, everything is not rainbows and puppies. It is really a struggle. It is a difficult thing. Just that anything surrounding the word fire would be the one word that I think helps us to understand Numbers. And you can think about this from a purification standpoint as well. Israel is really purified by fire. They have their entire nation reset essentially, and they're going to come through the other side of this prepared to enter Canaan. So there are both senses of that, I think, in the book.
Fire is a really interesting metaphor, and God is pictured in terms of fire. The pillar of fire that led them through the darkness in the wilderness and at the Red Sea. Fire is inherently good and inherently dangerous. Being in the presence of fire makes all the difference in the world. You have warmth, you have heat, you have light, you have, you can cook your meals now instead of eating them raw. It makes all the difference in the world, but fire has to be controlled. It has to be pointed in the right direction. And the fire of God is the greatest blessing there is if it is used in the right way. But when we fall under the wrath of God, our God is a consuming fire in Hebrews. If we are on the wrong side of the fire, we're going to pay the penalty. Ask Nadab and Abihu about that.
Right.
The fire that they were supposed to work with was a good thing. It turned into a terrible thing because they didn't have the right relationship with the fire, which is to say they didn't have the right relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who can dwell with this God? Is the phrase. Who can be really near him and in his presence? Without an intercessor, that's not possible. Without a system in place where you can approach that fire in a way that's beneficial to you and not hazardous to you.
Yeah.
Is a big key idea. Of course, that's the thing that is installed in Israel in Exodus. Don't touch the mountain. Don't approach. There's the fire of the Lord on top of the mountain. That concept of beneficial but hazardous. Where fire is not malicious. Fire is fire, and you have to treat it appropriately. And God uses that as a way to describe being in His presence, dealing with Himself. You mentioned it's interesting. You mentioned the garden. So my one garden reference, and I have to make one. The story in the Garden of Eden between chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2, things are going well. Chapter 3, everything comes to a screeching halt. Right, everything goes terribly beginning in chapter 3. You have the same thing in Numbers. As Israel sets out from Mount Sinai in chapter 10, they are in order. Everyone's carrying whatever section of the tabernacle they're supposed to. Judah's up front like they're supposed to be. They're following the Ark of the Covenant, the clouds with them. You have the blessing that's pronounced by Moses at the end of chapter 10. And then chapter 11, it all falls apart. They start complaining about their misfortunes. I mentioned this a couple days ago in our class. What misfortunes? We're not told in 11 and verse 1 what was the problem. And that might actually be part of the point. God's people are going to encounter misfortunes. They're going to encounter difficulties. They're going to encounter problems. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we respond to them, and how do we relate to God in those circumstances? Israel relates to God poorly in 11 and verse 1 and several times throughout the book. Many have noted that Numbers is the book about complaining and weeping and grumbling and so forth. That betrays one's true belief about God. If you are complaining about God's actions, you're really saying, I think God could do better and He's not. And that helps us with a lot of what goes on in Numbers. Why do Miriam and Moses, Aaron try to take over? Why do the sons of Korah try to take over? Why does Israel try to go into the land of Canaan? It's this fundamental belief that God could do better and He's not, which is a statement against God's character.
Right.
One that he does not take lightly at any turn.
And that brings us back to where we started with the crossing over in chapter 13. Mm-hmm. You don't like the wilderness, you don't like your life in the wilderness, then leave the wilderness. You were never intended to spend 40 years in the wilderness. This was preparatory. This is not about how you feel in the moment. It's about how God is going to make you feel in the future. And there's a reason why we have so many hymns about Canaan land and crossing the Jordan and all. This is one of the most powerful metaphors in the Old Testament. The idea of living our lives as pilgrims in the wilderness, waiting for something better, dealing with adversity, trusting in God, believing that there is something better on the horizon if we will just have faith, if we will walk where He tells us to walk. If we would just do that, it would be so much easier for us. It's not about how you feel in the wilderness. It's not about how you feel for your 70 years. It's about what God is doing with you and doing for you, especially in the future. And oftentimes we just don't have enough faith and we start complaining like they did because we're so bound to the present. We're so bound to the wilderness that we can't see Canaan. And God's trying to help us through that.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's the wilderness is what Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 10. Don't do like they did is sort of the message of that chapter. Don't be like them. And then he gives several examples, many of them from Numbers, of here's what they did, and we need to avoid that at all costs because
And those were people who were baptized into Moses.
right.
We talked about this last Wednesday in our Bible class. We're baptized into Jesus, and we think that we can't fall. And Paul says, lots of other people had a life-changing, life-altering, overwhelming experience that brought them into a relationship with the God the Father, and they died because they did not live accordingly. And the same thing can happen to us.
Yep. There's that call for endurance.
Absolutely.
Keep going till you get there, and trust in the Lord as you do.
All right. Well, our time is up. Thank you very much, Kyle, for being with me here this
Hey,
week and reading through the text.
well,
As always, thanks to Jerry Tesh and the fellows at Narrow Way for providing the music in our intro. Check them out at www.narrowway.com. And be reading Deuteronomy, the whole book. Yes, it's another long reading, but stick with it. And check out my other podcast, Citizen of Heaven. If you like what you're hearing, like, subscribe, and especially share. Until then, this is Hal Hammons, and we'll see you next week. Read your Bible.